WCAG Success Criteria 1.4.12 Text Spacing. Hi everyone, welcome to Accessibility with Meg. This is Meg, and today we are going to learn a little bit about 1.4.12 text spacing from WCAG. Now, text spacing basically is talking about the space that you find within the content of or the text content on your web page, right? This space can exist as line height, that is in between lines. It can exist as spacing between paragraphs. It can be spacing between the letters or the alphabet, the characters on the screen. It can also be spacing between words on the screen, right? So there are certain specifications that need to be met for text spacing to be all right for people with low vision or for people with reading disorders like dyslexia, etc., right? So the requirement says that the line height, which is also called the line spacing, is at least 1.5 times the font size, right? So the line height needs to be at least 1.5 times the font size. The spacing following paragraphs has to be at least 2 times the font size. Next is letter spacing, which is also called as tracking. And letter spacing basically is the spacing between the characters or the letters on the in the sentence, right? So that has to be at least 0.12 times the font size. And word spacing has to be at least 0.16 times the font size. Word spacing is nothing but spacing between the different words. There is an exception to this, which is that if you have languages or scripts that do not use one or any of those styling properties, then you can that can be an exception, right? I mean, you don't really need to cater to that. Also, it's important to note that it is not the content that we see on the screen that needs to conform to text spacing requirements, but when we actually apply text spacing to the content, then the content shouldn't get cut off or shouldn't go off screen, etc. Right? So that's important. That's what we are talking about here. How it's explained is note 1, content is not required to use these text spacing values. The requirement is to ensure that when a user overrides the author text spacing, content or functionality is not lost, right? That's important. Some writing systems for some languages use different text spacing settings, such as paragraphs. Paragraphs, they start with indents. So authors are encouraged to follow locally available guidance for improving readability and legibility of text in their writing systems. And there are certain languages we know that don't read left to right, but right to left, right? And so, most of them will apply for those, but there will be exceptions, and just work with those exceptions as required. So let's simply understand what this means when, say, we have a base font size of 16 pixels. So how do you calculate the minimum dimensions required to meet WCAG 1.4.12, which is text spacing, right? So if the font size is 16 pixels, then your line height has to be at least 1.5 times the font size, right? So that would be 16 pixels into 1.5, which is at least 24 pixels. The paragraph spacing, as we know, should be double the font size. So when it is double the font size, in this case, because the font size is 16 pixels, the paragraph spacing should be at least 32 pixels. Okay. Letter spacing, if the font size is 16 pixels, the letter spacing should be at least 0.12 times the font size. So in this case, it's 1.92 pixels. Word spacing, it should be 0.16 times the font size, which is in this case 16 pixels into 0.16. So it would be a 2.56 pixels. Again, always remember that these are not the dimensions for what the content should look like, the content, but when somebody is, say, zooming in or is using another setting wherein the base font has increased, right? So in that case, all the spacing should be according to that base font for legibility. So that's what text spacing says. We will now just see how we can test this for accessibility. Okay, the way that we would test for text spacing, because it has so many different parameters that need to be working at the same time, we tend to use a bookmarklet for testing for text spacing. That's the best way that you could do an accessibility test for text spacing is by using a bookmarklet. Now, the text spacing bookmarklet, you can find it at this location, which is the html5accessibility.com/tests/ts bookmarklet.html. Now, the easy way is to simply drag this text spacing into, simply just drag it like this into your bookmarklets bar or just right click and save it. Okay, so you just add it to your bookmarks, right? That's what you would do here, like put it in this banner somewhere or within your bookmarks. And then when you do that, you can just click on it to test for accessibility for text spacing. Okay, so all that, let's move to this website here, and just going to move up a little bit so you can see this. So we can see that the font sizes are like this. I'm going to apply the bookmarklet on this and make sure that no content is lost when we do that, right? So I have it right here, the text spacing bookmarklet. I'm simply just going to click on it. And so you've seen that the text spacing has been applied. You can find that it has spaced out correctly and there is no loss of content. Really, that's what you're looking at. Depending on the font size, the application of the bookmarklet has added the right parameters and requirements as we had spoken before, and we see that no content is lost in any which way, and so this test passes. That's simply the test that you would do, is just use the bookmarklet and check. You could also use a automated an automated tool like Axe DevTools, sorry. And if you use something like Axe DevTools, it will pick up a text spacing issue if it exists. But to be very sure, just use the bookmarklet, because bookmarklet makes checks for all the parameters that we need for text spacing. So here we see again back inside of the bookmarklet. This is your CSS. First, let's just have a look at the HTML. that's your it's basically a JavaScript function, and that's what's working here. But the CSS looks something like this for all the different elements on the page. This wildcard star means that the line height is 1.5. That's important, so it has to happen. Letter spacing is this much, and the word spacing is the 0.16 m that we had spoken about. And depending on whatever is the font size, these will be applied to that. And so that's how you would check for text spacing. Okay. Thank you. And if you like what you see, please like, subscribe, or share, and that will help me. Thank you so much.